Is this on? Great. Why don't we get started? Please have a seat while I turn up the microphone volume. Okay, great. Can you hear me? Okay, great, perfect. Got duct tape on this microphone. So I'm going to be careful adjusting it. Okay, hello everyone. Thanks for coming. Great to see such a good turnout. It's me again, Stephanie Lin. I'm the Dean of the School of Architecture, and it's my great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker tonight, Michelle Millar Fisher, who's joining us from Boston/Providence. As some of you know, we're welcoming Michelle back to the school, but in a new location. Michelle and I first met almost a year ago when she was in the midst of a 1.5-year-long journey across the US via Amtrak to visit various schools, including TSoA. As is the usual, I invited all of our students to this meeting, and we coincidentally ended up with an entirely female group of MArch and immersion students, discussing our individual relationships to craft, and the various experiences that have formed our own diverse notions and sometimes less conventional ideas of what craft is and how and where it is nurtured. The conversation moved from the studio, the school studio location, to the dorms where we enjoyed tea and snacks and continued to talk. A few months later, Michelle and I reconnected on her publication while I was overseeing our summer program in Chicago, and we're yet again continuing this conversation back in Arizona at Cattletrack, a place that is distinctively a place of craft, and we're very grateful to be part of this new environment. This is the third event in our series titled The Shapes of Pedagogy that explores the spaces, structures, and practices of experimental pedagogy in architectural education, which has included to date a roundtable on our evolving educational models, an immersive tour of our campus, community, and work, and of course, today's presentation by Michelle. This series is intentionally in parallel with the design work that's happening in our year-long vertical studio led by Matthew Trevitowski, in which all students are engaging the design of a future campus expansion that embodies the research, values, and particular attention to the culture of material experimentation that happens at the school. In this context, I couldn't wait to invite Michelle back to present the perspectives in her research that can inform how we approach craft in architecture schools, including ours. We'll of course have the opportunity to follow with a discussion with everyone here tonight in the audience and continue the conversation during a reception outside to follow. Michelle Millar Fisher is the Ronald C. and Anita L. Warnick Curator of Contemporary Decorative Arts at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, and has previously worked at MoMA, the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and the Guggenheim. Her work focuses on the intersections of people, power, and the material world. She's working on craft schools where we make what we inherit, which she will of course present tonight, which took her on a train journey across all 48 contiguous US states. She leads an independent team on a book, touring exhibition, and program series called Designing Motherhood, Things That Make and Break Our Births. And she's told me that she'll be presenting that work tomorrow at ASU, I believe. Michelle holds an MA and an MPhil in art history from the University of Glasgow and received an MPhil from the Graduate Center at the City University of New York, where she is her PhD. Please join me in welcoming Michelle Millar Fisher, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for such a generous introduction, Stephanie. Can you hear me all right? Okay, no? Okay, 1 second. You know what I can do? I might just bring this up ever so slightly. Oh, no, that's the wrong one to bring up. This one here, right? Yeah. Better now?
Yeah,
better now. Yeah, okay. Only by an inch, I think. Thank you so much for such a generous introduction, Stephanie. Thank you to Harris, who picked me up very late from the airport last night. And thank you to you all for spending your Friday evening with me. It's very kind. You could be doing many other things. I'm going to keep my timer just here so I don't go more than about 35 minutes. Does that sound right to you, Stephanie? Okay. Nobody needs more than 30 minutes of me on a Friday evening. And I will advance this first slide. Great. Fantastic. So before I begin, I guess I will say two caveats. The first one is that I'm not really going to talk about architectural history this evening, or even architecture per se. I am a lapsed architectural historian, but I'm working in a craft history and craft museum context just now, and so that's going to be the bulk of what I'm talking about. And in many ways, I'm talking about the museum, so what I really am going to take you through is a story of how to move a little bit through bureaucracy in order to get a project to happen, which actually you will know a lot about as architects. So I think there will be points of confluence and resonance. And I hope really by just sharing a story of how I came to undertake this research project, which is still very much research in progress, I can share the formation of an idea and where it's at just now. And I think that resonates with the way that you all do research as well, the way that you think of ideas and then come to them through. Tell you about a journey that I took across the United States, as Stephanie said, via Amtrak over the last year and a half, 2 years, over 5 different train routes. And the resulting project, Craft Schools. And I did it in order to explore the collection that I came to when I came to the Museum of Fine Arts Boston in 2019. I came and I was brought in really as a steward of their contemporary craft collection, which, as I will explain, really circles around a fairly robust collection of studio craft. And I will explain what studio craft is momentarily, just in case that's a new term for folks. But in many ways, I came to the project of craft schools when I came to the museum because I wanted to try and write a different type of craft history. And in all honesty, by doing so, to teach myself craft history, because I did not come to the museum as a craft historian at all. My working knowledge of American history, period, let alone American craft history, was rough, let's say. So it was limited and I wanted to know more. So the project, as I'll explain this evening, is being realized in a number of different ways. The first one and foremost one in many ways is the book. And that's what I'm right in the middle of just now. I have a manuscript deadline for the end of this year. But it's also been a series of public programs. It is a series of acquisitions into the museum's collection. And it's also, I hope, going to be a series of very small exhibitions coming up in the next year or two. And I actually have some descriptions of the exhibitions at the end. It's the first time I haven't even really shared them at work yet. And so I'll share them with you and you can tell me whether or not you think it's a good idea. First of all, though, I should give a little bit of background on my bio as sort of context for this particular project. And I'll make it really short, but I'm always very happy to talk about how I came to be in the museum context doing this work if it's of interest to anyone. I grew up in the Scottish borders, which you can see on the screen just here. When I grew up, it had the title of being the largest swath of Scotland without any rail link. And it took a very windy a bus to get from where I lived to Edinburgh over the course of 2 hours. So it was very, very rural. And I grew up around all kinds of craft, although I would not have ever used that term really to describe it, nor would the folks who I grew up with. So it was a space that was deeply connected to textile trade, although that had been deindustrialized from the 1970s onwards. But I grew up next to people who, I kept sheep, I kept chickens, I kept ducks, a lot of animal husbandry. My neighbor was a glass maker. We grew up still with Loch Carron and other mills around. And so there was craft there, but I never thought about it in the more institutionalized way that I think about it today. I then came to the United States in 2005. I did so kind of by mistake. I was a cook through university. One thing about Scotland that is great, it's totally free to go to school. So I'm the first in my family to pass high school. I went, I thought I was going to become a veterinarian. I didn't. I started studying literature and then happened into a design history course, and it sort of changed my life. But I needed money to live while I was going through college. So I was a cook until the last semester of my undergraduate degree in art history. history. And I went to my professor and I said, I need some kind of work experience that pays. And she said, well, you could be a security guard at the museum. I said, that sounds great. And so that's how I started out my museum career. I said, but I'd like something a little bit closer to the arts if possible. And she said, well, I know someone whose husband's an artist and he needs help on the farm, and you came from a farm. Why don't you do that as well? It turned out that he was Andy Goldsworthy, who's a British sculptor who does a lot of work outside. And so I spent a long time showing Andy sticks or twigs or pieces of rock and saying, this one, and he would say no, and I would go get another one. And so that was my introduction to the arts. And so I applied very confidently to about 15 different internships on the East Coast of the United States, thinking I really want to go somewhere other than this tiny country that I come from. And of course, got turned down by all of them. And then somebody in the Guggenheim internship program that summer had something they wanted to do more. And so they dropped out, their backup dropped out as well. And I ended up being the intern who was called upon. So at 3 weeks' notice, I moved to New York. I lived in the YMCA just around the corner from the Guggenheim, and that's how I started out in museums. And to be honest, I loved museums, but I loved New York more, and I was really happy to be in that city. So I ended up staying for 4 years. I worked in education there. I worked for a year in the Arms and Armament department at the Metropolitan Museum, getting more curatorial experience. And I then went to start my PhD in 2009. I'm finishing it just this year, and so I can also talk about that, why that took so long. But it was about 10 years ago that I began a curatorial career. I was at MoMA as a curatorial assistant, a job I applied for about 6 times before I got it. And I worked under 2 phenomenal curators there, wonderful design historians, Julia Kinchin and Paola Antonelli. And so I worked on the collection. We did special projects like Design of Violence or Items, the first fashion show that had been there in about 70 years. And we also brought in new works to the collection. I then went to the Philadelphia Museum of Art, where I worked on the Designs for Different Futures exhibition. That's where Designing Motherhood also started as well. And actually, Stephanie, right next to you, I have a Designing Motherhood book, just in case you want to pass it around. I brought it as an example of what the Craft Schools book might end up looking like, actually, because it's the same designer. And now I work at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. I'm in the contemporary department, so I work across all media. I think across our department, we say we're working with living people making things. But I am really meant to be looking after the craft collection there. And the most recent exhibition that I've helped curate is Tender Loving Care, which is a collection reinstallation of about 100 works. And for the first time, we've really synthesized what we would call, at least in the institution, contemporary craft as part of this hang. So I offer this background to say that even now, after about 4 years of pretty intensive research, I would not call myself a craft historian. I definitely don't feel like I'm an expert on craft, but I feel like that position of sort of being a jack of all trades in a sense, at least within the museum field, has really inflected the Craft Schools project. I was interested when I came to the museum in learning as much as I could about craft history in the American sense. And there are so many craft histories underneath that particular umbrella. But I wanted it to be something always that was open, accessible, and really fueled by curiosity rather than something authoritative. And so that is what the project has ended up being. So as a way to describe what the project is now, I want to describe a little bit about where it emerged from. When I got to Boston in 2019, the first thing that I was asked to do was to create a collection strategy, which is basically a roadmap for what is going to happen with the collection over a 3 to 5 year period. I apologize for sharing this with you because it is the driest document in the world. I tried to think of a different PowerPoint slide that I could put up. There's no other. This is what a collection strategy looks like. It can be actually really interesting to write because you have to have a deep knowledge of the collection, but it's terrifying to write coming in 2019 because I didn't know the collection at all. And so I spent about 3 or 4 months really diving as deep as I could in. And it's a way to keep accountable, right? You write this document and then the exhibitions, the acquisitions, the programs that you do over the next 3 to 5 years, you can look back and say, did I really do what I said I was going to? And this collection document goes to your chief curator, your director of collections, the director. Each curator writes one, so you kind of all have the same roadmap that you're funneling into. So I handed mine in the 3rd week of 2020, and I really just may as well have shredded it. Nothing that I wanted to do from it could really happen after the pandemic occurred. And so I decided to change tack. I couldn't really carry out the work that I thought I had been kind of called to do at the museum. So I decided, how would I learn if I can't go into storage, look at the collection, do the exhibitions that might pull from it? I could at least go back to the people who had created the collection in the first place over the last 50 years. So in those first months of the pandemic, I actually Zoomed with about 14 or 15 people who had held my job before me over the last 50 years. And I asked them, how did you come to build the... And have I inadvertently hit a button?
Oh, no, it says it is streaming.
I can see us.
Yeah, okay. You know what? I don't want to mess with it, so I'm just going to let it keep going. Okay. Okay. It is
No
what
worries.
it is.
Okay, fantastic. No worries. And if you need to come up and have a look again, go for it. Yeah. So I went back and asked my predecessors, how did you make the craft collection? And they told me a lot, not just about what they had discussed as the definition of craft at that particular point in time, or who they had gone to collect craft from, but they also discussed some of the programs that they had been part of creating. One of my favorites is the Please Be Seated program at the museum, where since 1975 we commission makers to create seating which can be used in the museum galleries, but is also part of the collection too. I also read as extensively as I could. And so the next slide, my husband started getting really panicked about the volume of books that was coming into our home over the pandemic. This is a small sampling of them. I had to buy several new shelves, but I really, I had degrees as an art historian. I had then gone into design, curatorial work, and there was connection. My PhD exams were actually in architectural history, but craft history had its own discourse and discipline that I really didn't know, and I was sort of learning by teaching myself. And what I heard from the people who were my predecessors, and what I also learned from reading through these books, was how closely aligned the building of the collection, or the writing of craft history, I should say, was how closely it was connected to the canons of education that these folks had inherited. It mattered where they'd gone to school, and that seems like a no-brainer, but so many of them, for example, had gone to one particular program at Yale, or ended up teaching at one particular program at Yale. Many of them had gone to one or two different collections where they learned a particular version of what craft was, or contemporary craft was. And so as I was listening to them and reading as much as I could, I recognized that education was particularly important in the formation of craft history as it has been received, at least in the institutional space that I work in. They had inherited these canons of craft knowledge. They had gone on to teach in other places. They had inherited material knowledge when they'd gone to a local craft school, perhaps to understand woodworking or glass blowing, so they could better understand the collection that they were stewarding at the museum. And so that was a particularly important revelation. In fact, I have the slide here, New American Furniture in the Maker's Hand. If I go back, Ned Cook, who's at the bottom of the images here, he is now at Yale, but he held my job before me about 40 years ago. He then went on to teach many different craft historians. There are few craft historians working in museums, and so it's a small group of people. One of whom has been particularly influential, Glenn Adamson, but there are others as well. And so Ned taught Glenn. Glenn then went on to teach a number of people who are now in the small number of positions working with craft collections in museums. And then Ned also was part of Boston University at the time when he was at the MFA, and over 50% of the people in this seminal catalog for woodworking in the United States as part of craft history were from that particular program. So these constellations, these connections, often based in friendship, certainly, but absolutely based in the networks of education, became increasingly visible to me in terms of the importance that they had had in inflecting what was institutionally received, at least in the museum, as craft history. And of course, I recognize, and I will get to the fact that there are many, many, many other craft histories than the ones that have been institutionally recognized. In fact, it was almost as important as the people who have a ton of money who give things to the museum. So these are some of the donor books that have inflected craft history in the United States. My position is named for the Warnicks, really wonderful collectors based in San Francisco, who have been sort of seminally important in shaping the field of craft within museums, but Helen Drutt, for example, too, the Farragos, we have a large, like many hundreds of works in the MFA's collection donated by Daphne Farrago. So these constellations of donors, very important in shaping what craft is in the museum, but as important were these constellations of educators and education. And I give a little digression here to say that although craft has certainly been institutionalized in museums like the MFA, it sort of still occupies a strange and liminal place in a sense. There has always been a divide between what is craft and what is fine art, and we are in a museum that has fine arts in its title. And we have a lovely new-ish, built in the last 15 years, contemporary wing built by IMPA. The craft gallery is in what was meant to be the museum store as part of that wing, so not the best place for craft, and it really hasn't had the same upgrades as the rest of the spaces have. And so it exists in this sort of like a little bit of a strange space. There has been a pushing of the envelope in terms of what craft means at the MFA over the last couple of years. My position was moved from the Arts of the Americas department into the Contemporary department. And I had a wonderful predecessor in that role, Emily Zilber, who created exhibitions like this one, Crafted Objects in Flux, that looked beyond a sort of a merely material sense of what craft was. But I really feel like in many senses, craft in the collection, as I came to know it through this sort of odyssey of reading, of listening to curators before me, of thinking about how collectors had been cultivated in their tastes, came down to this very particular vein of craft. And so as I read more and more and learned more and more, I came to the term studio craft. And I'm wondering how many folks here know this as sort of a working term within their own disciplinary discourses. No? Okay, so a few people, but not necessarily everyone. So studio craft, there was an efflorescence of studio craft post-1945, and exactly as it says here, craft often seeking the same status and platform as fine art around it, facilitated in great part by the GI Bill, and really dedicated to allowing makers in certain material disciplines, wood, clay, metal, for example, to create one-of-a-kind works, often driven as much by concept as by material knowledge, in a manner that sort of drew parallels with some of their compatriots within the quote-unquote fine art world. There's a lot to unpack in many of those terms, certainly, a lot of value statements, a lot of hierarchies, and indeed those are important in particular in the context of museum history. But you see here, for example, a spread from a really wonderful Life magazine profile of about 8 or 9 different craft artists from 1966. Both Bill Sachs and Dorian Zakai actually worked at BU in the 70s and 80s, and were particularly important to the sort of rise of what became known as studio craft. And that really is the dominant history of what I have at the museum. And that was new news to me as I was sort of learning what I had at the museum in our collection. It was created in this post-war period, not just by the artists themselves, but by a whole entire infrastructure that would take another good 2 hours to explain and describe. And a particularly important figure in this history is Aileen Osborne Webb, who was a ceramicist in her own right, but also a wealthy philanthropist from Vanderbilt fortune. And she did a number of different things from the 1930s and 40s onwards. She looked at craft as many things, but certainly as a driver for economic independence and sort of regional economic gain. And so she created national superstructures to join different makers in different parts of the United States and offer them ways to sell and promote their work. So she did so by creating Craft Horizons, a shelter magazine that you see here, America House, which was opposite MoMA in Midtown, and not only retailed but also showed makers, again, in these sort of material-specific disciplinary areas. And she was also one of the driving forces behind the Museum of Contemporary Crafts, which is now the Museum of Art and Design in Columbus Circle in New York. So from the 1960s onwards, really sort of pushing the exhibition of work too. And she also was particularly important in sort of driving a market for contemporary craft at that moment in time. So the collectors whose books that I showed you, who amassed these collections and then gave them to museums, were born in this moment in time, cultivated in this moment in time. And so that whole structure sort of gave me what I have within the museum today. Many different craft schools were either born during this period or really flourished during this period. And so education, very important to this story too. That was made possible, as many of you will know, the history of the GI Bill, allowing people who may not have been able to undertake higher education, coming back from World War II and being able to do so, and being able to do so with some fairly generous stipends, so not necessarily having to choose a quote-unquote sensible profession, but being able to go into something that they really felt excited by or moved by. What I will say, though, is that the other part of it, the other part of the education element that is particularly important, that I came to find as, again, I read and I spoke to collectors and curators, was that in these histories of craft, often histories of studio craft, the GI Bill has until very recently been thought of quite uncritically as this wonderful opening, accessible way that people gained an education. But of course, as this slide suggests, and as more recent scholarship suggests, much like mortgages, for example, were circumscribed and often handed out to majority white, majority male candidates, much of the resources from the GI Bill were also very asymmetrically experienced. And so I wanted to find a way to, as I learned this history, not only sort of honor it, because it really was part of the DNA of what I realized the collection at the MFA was, but to find a way to expand upon it, because I am interested in the politics of education. I come from a country where I was able to gain an education for free. I wanted to think about educations that might exist outside of some of the institutions that had given us the major proponents of studio craft that were in our collection. And I wanted just to think about craft more broadly. I didn't want to think about studio craft as the only history of craft within institutions. I wanted to think about people who had been taught in much broader senses, in much broader ways, and who held much broader histories. And I will offer a sidebar here. I got so interested in it that I decided to write 2 books. I changed my dissertation topic. So I came back to my dissertation in 2021 after I started thinking about craft schools and decided to look at 3 of them in particular in the 1970s, what's known as the Craft Renaissance, and think about Peters Valley School of Craft in New Jersey, the BU program in the 70s and 80s in Boston, and Pratt in Seattle, and part of the Pacific Northwest Renaissance of glass. And so this was a long, deep dive for me, which has been really, really pleasurable. And this is the outcome of it that I actually was able to print out for the first time 2 weeks ago. So I finally got there after more than a decade of trying to write something. It was meant to be an architectural history dissertation early on. So I decided that I would come to this project, Craft Schools. I wanted to come from that initial kernel that had sparked my inquiry in the first place, which was the collection strategy, which is meant to be a roadmap on paper. And I thought, well, what would it look like if I actually created an actual roadmap and didn't do it on the road because I'm a terrible driver, I don't want to be in an environmentally unfriendly mode of transport. What would happen if I just used Amtrak? That would give me a framework across the United States to hang this inquiry on. It's more environmentally friendly. I feel safer as a woman traveling on my own, and I'm not looking necessarily to reproduce the history of one man and his dog, or 2 men and the dog, or whatever, taking a car across the states. I wanted it to be slightly different. And so I pitched this idea to my chief curator, Reto, and to my humongous surprise, he said yes, which was great. And so I went away for about 3 or 4 weeks at a time over the course of about 2 years to undertake these journeys. And this was the research question that I asked at every single stop. I wanted to ask a question that, again, could honor that studio craft history. When I ask this of somebody who's gone to some of the very well-known schools that I visited, they will say somebody's name who's probably in our collection, who we have given an exhibition to, who has at some point been feted in the history of studio craft. But it was my hypothesis that was definitely proved right, that if I asked this question, and I could ask it of each of you just now, who's the teacher that brought you to your practice? Who's the most important teacher that you've had? You might very well say somebody who I don't have any idea of, I've never met before, but has been incredibly important to you. So often when I ask this question on my travels, it was somebody's grandparent, or it was a community member, it was a neighbor, it was a high school art teacher a lot of the time, got really big shout outs, sometimes a kindergarten teacher. But there was a much broader and more expansive pantheon of teaching and learning and knowledge sharing that I was able to listen to and then formulate into different histories across the United States than I would have if I just looked at what we had in the collection and thought about the histories of how that knowledge had come to bear on what we had collected. So I ended up traveling very cheaply by train. I took my sleeping bag with me, and so there were one or two times where I could find a berth on the sleeper carriage, but most of the time I just put my, it was mask a lot of the time too at this point in 2021, my sleeping mask on my eyes, and then put my sleeping bag on and slept in the chair. I got to see a lot of really interesting parts of the landscape. This was a different experience than being on the highway. It was also a different experience than flying over. So it was a really interesting way to, I by no means have any, I do not think in any way that I saw the United States, but I was able to more fully be present, at least in understanding some of the landscape through which I was traveling, I think, through this mode of transport. And I got some funding from the Center for Craft in Asheville in North Carolina. So I was able to make it to each state for about $350 or $400. I decided to really define my project before I went. And so thinking about craft, I wanted to think about it as an ethos and not necessarily by the material specific ways that the museum, with its taxonomy and its love of putting things in pigeonholes, had asked me to do and had historically done. So while I was respecting and honoring and very interested to hear people's material specific knowledge around clay or around wood or around metal, I was interested to think about craft as an ethos or a way of being, sometimes very definitely from the 70s, a lifestyle, and to think about the accessibility of those ways of living through craft as well. And then what I meant by schools really ranged. I went certainly to established schools, including TSoA, of course, but I also went to places that were in people's front rooms, that were in high schools, on reservations sometimes, that were in back gardens, that were in places that weren't necessarily something that would have even called itself a school. It was maybe most broadly a place of knowledge transfer. My journey was definitely informed by others who had done similar things before me, including the seminal Objects USA exhibition that occurred in 1969, where two curators, Lee Nordness, who was a gallerist in New York, and Paul Smith, who was the inaugural curator and director at the Museum of Contemporary Craft, now MAD, they, in the late 60s, traveled many thousands of miles across the US, went to studios and also craft fairs, and brought together about 500 works by about 300 different craft artists, and showed them at the Smithsonian. It went then on to travel across 22 other venues across 5 years. So it was a really, really important exhibition that also had things like a documentary that aired on ABC. So it had this sort of very popular appeal for contemporary craft in that moment. And I was also informed by other writers who had gone across the US. Certainly, yes, sort of logging, travel, sometimes leisure. But also thinking about much harder and sometimes forced migration. So thinking about movement, certainly in my case, as a privilege that was fairly safe most of the time, but others, including using trains that had not always had that privilege or that safety. So this is me leaving Providence in 2021 and then coming back on February 18th in 2023. I did obviously come back some more times. I wasn't away for the whole 2 years. I do look like I've aged about a decade in the second picture. But it was nice. It was really nice to be home. And I will share just a few of the places that I went, and I'm more than happy to dig in a little bit more to some of these places in the Q&A. So I went to Berea College in Kentucky. I'm not sure how many of you have either been or know about it. That's the Broomcraft program that you see on the left-hand side of your screen. Berea in Kentucky is one of only 9 true work-study programs, or universities, or colleges, I should say, in the United States, where if you go, you get a full ride in return for working. And so work-study is often meant to mean sort of a partial ride, or a set number of hours every week for some tuition reduction. But there it really is, everybody goes for free, and you can either go be on the lawn mowing crew, or on the maintenance crew, or in the canteen, but you can also be part of the craft program, which has a phenomenal ceramics program, a wood program, and also a broomcraft program. So you have biologists next to art history majors, next to others who learn each part of the process, for example, of making a broom, and then these go out into the world to be bought and used. It has had a long history of doing this over the last 100 and something years. And it was also, very importantly, one of the first desegregated colleges in the South. From the late 19th century, it actually became segregated again as legislation forced it to do, and then in the 1950s desegregated again as soon as legislation allowed it to. I also went to the American College of Building Arts in South Carolina. It was phenomenal. I was just back there again actually in October. I walked into the studio that you see here. It's the stonemason studio. It was like going into the nave of a medieval cathedral. It was phenomenal. The sound doesn't come across in the picture, but it was really, really fantastic. That's Iris in the middle, and then Joe Kincannon, who's walking in the background. Joe learned his craft at St. John the Divine in the 1970s as they were rebuilding that in Harlem on an apprentice program, and is now one of the teachers there, and Iris is learning from him. It was formed as a college in 1999 in South Carolina after a very large hurricane, which is fairly usual there. South Carolina and Charleston in specifically where this college is well known for its building preservation, and they found that they didn't have enough skilled workers to actually create or recreate what had been lost through the hurricane. And so they decided to make a school so that they could train people in things like stonemasonry or timber framing or other elements like that. Daryl Montana in Louisiana has been learning how to combine his indigenous and African-American heritage making Mardi Gras suits for the last 50 years. He was taught by his father. And so when I asked him, who is the teacher that brought you to your practice? It was this familial connection, which it was for so many others. Sarah McIntosh at the Chicago School of Shoemaking. Many people haven't heard of it. Maybe you haven't, but if you're in that neighborhood, you know the school because it's very much part of the community. She learned how to make her first shoes in the 70s. She was sort of an original back to the lander, didn't want to pay somebody for shoes that were going to break immediately, and then so learned the craft herself. And when I asked her, who taught you? She said, well, I'm self-taught. I really have just taught myself. I came to knowing this because I wanted to have that knowledge. And about 2 minutes at the end of our 2-hour conversation before I left, I was in her office and I pointed to this picture that you see on the pinboard. And I said, who's that? I didn't know if it was her or not, so I didn't want to assume. She said, oh, that's me. And she said, actually, and she looked at it for a second and she said, it's my mom who taught me about craft. I'm wearing something that she made. She made all of my uniforms and my outfits. And so she was really the person who gave me my first sewing skills. And those are still the skills that I use today. Sonia Fonda McNair, this is her back garden in very urban Toledo, Ohio, as a Black woman who had some very significant issues with getting healthcare as she wished to. She decided to grow her own medicines and what she needed in the back of her garden, thinking about health as personal wealth, and teaches that to others, much like she learned from her great aunt in Shreveport, Louisiana, which is the picture that you see there. I went to go see Jenny Williams in Lapwai, Idaho. She's been teaching for the last 44 years at the Lapwai High School, which is on reservation. She's teaching the types of skills that she did not get to learn herself from her mom or her grandmother, who were made to go to assimilative boarding schools. So thinking about the ways in which pedagogy actually stops us learning, or the ways in which schools are not always positive places for everybody. And then in the last 2 minutes that I have, I'll just note a few others very quickly because I know that I'm heading towards the 35-minute mark. Margaret Bruning left a career as an advertising executive in Los Angeles and moved to West Virginia about 6 years ago to start raising sheep, something that I did when I was a teenager. And so I definitely had to go say hi to her. And she took me through the apprenticeship program that West Virginia runs as part of its state investment in craft. She was an apprentice to somebody who was a weaver. And then I'm looking at some of the places that are in Boston as well. The inquiry started there. North Bennett Street School, that started as a place for folks who were immigrating to the city to come and learn basic skills that they could then take on to gain employment in the city, has now become a really well-known program for its wood, furniture making, timber framing. I went to go see Jenny Joseph to look at the craft of midwifery. I just went to do a visit with somebody in Boston about the craft of classic automobile repair, which was really fascinating. And then in the last couple of slides, I think it might, oh, no, it hasn't frozen. I went to look at Beth Lowe's work in Montana, a very, very brilliant ceramicist who was taught at the University of Montana by a really well-known, and I know, Jennifer, you know Beth's work really well. We're sitting in the company of two phenomenal ceramicists. But Beth was taught by Rudy Ortio, one of those really important figures at the beginning of studio craft in the 1950s, along with folks like Peter Volkas. She came in and inherited both his ways of making and knowing, certainly, and honored them. But as a Chinese American woman who was also a mother, she brought a very different biographical and personal bent to her work that I think was very inspirational for people who had otherwise been in what was a fairly macho culture within the ceramics field. And this is the work that we were able to bring into the collection. A couple of images just here of some of the acquisitions that we've been able to make from this project. So her work made in the last couple of years has now become part of our permanent collection. But in addition to bringing work into the collection, we've been able to do these wonderful conversations. Anytime we acquire a work into the museum, we also have an artist conversation, which we record, transcribe, and it goes in the file so that a curator 200 years from now will know what the artist meant when they made their work and how they want it preserved for the future. So this is a way for us not only for me to have visited these people, but for us to hold these stories in trust in the museum for future generations. A couple more images of some of the works that we've been able to acquire by folks from across the stops that I've made. Some of these are now, actually all of these are now in the collection galleries that we have in the museum. So we are weaving these stories into the permanent displays that we have. We're also weaving these stories into special exhibitions. Bumi's Ceramics, a beautiful Adebumi Badebo, somebody that I met in Philly, the clay studio, and she makes her work from clay body that she retrieves from True Blue in South Carolina, where her ancestors some generations ago were forcibly enslaved on indigo and rice plantations. They still maintain a family cemetery there. It's where her own mom is buried. And so when we had an exhibition on the Edgefield Potters of South Carolina, she was one of the contemporary artists that we invited in. We acquired her work, and her work is now traveling with that special exhibition. This is her in the True Blue Cemetery gathering that clay body. So the project is now in the writing phase. I spent 2 weeks at Haystack this summer, which was wonderful, being able to write some up. But all of my evenings and weekends until January 15th are just doing this very furiously by my laptop. And also pitching the exhibition. So I'm hoping there will be 3 very tiny jewel box exhibitions of some of the things that I learned, looking at the region of New England and bringing in some of the artists and programs that I met there. Looking at knowledge bearers and thinking about Indigenous forms of knowledge that I was lucky enough to connect with, and bringing in some of those works. And thinking about some of the women-led initiatives and the ways in which women show up in craft and the way in which that is respected sometimes, fetishized other times. And that will be, I think, the 3rd and final jewel box exhibition, hopefully coming to the museum in the next 2 or so years. So that's a very brief overview of the project. I'm very happy to answer questions. Stephanie, you may have questions, or the audience might. But the main takeaway for me at the end of that inquiry was that although we had been able to create a really strong and wonderful collection at the MFA of contemporary craft, for me, I have in many ways moved away from thinking about objects. I like making exhibitions, and I shouldn't say this too loudly because my job is to do that, but I'm much more interested after spending time over the last 3 years researching in this manner on the people, the places, the site specificity of how these conversations happen, of the way that people and place shape pedagogy and shape the knowledge that we have around craft so much more in many ways than what we can learn perhaps in a fleeting visit through a museum gallery looking at an object. So thank you so much, and I look forward to conversation.
Unduct tape. It's sticky. Yeah. A little embarrassing for craft schools.
Well, thank you so much. That was amazing. My head's spinning. Are you being blinded by this light?
I moved very slightly.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank
Yeah.
you. Okay. Great. Thank you for that presentation. That was
Thank you for
such
having me.
the density of knowledge and all the experiences that you gained is really mind blowing. Maybe I'll kind of pick up on your last comment about the objects because I'm really interested in like how are you capturing the process through exhibition, visiting these places that are about the transfer of knowledge, and then perhaps the second goal of, or maybe it's not a goal, of sustaining that knowledge and how is that being displayed and presented?
It's a really good question, and I think the reason the exhibition is the very last part of this project is because it's the least useful platform format for this kind of inquiry. I'm loving writing the book because I can very keenly, I hope, my goal is to, much like the Designing Motherhood book, were interested in people's stories of birth and death. And so for us, getting that right was really important, and we would transcribe and write those stories, and if they included somebody's personal information, we would always run it past them to make sure that not only was it factually accurate, but that we had offered a good overview of who they were and what that story was and what it meant to them. And the same thing is happening with passwords. I finished the chapter on TSoA, and I'll send it to you, Stephanie, and you can share it with everybody here. And so, you know, as a journalist might hope that they can have some autonomy, and we hope for that with DM too. When we did that book, you know, we're trying to be objective in some sense in capturing a person or a place. We also want to be careful. So the book part has been really interesting and easy to do. Public programs have been interesting and easy to do. Teaching about it has been interesting and easy to do. The exhibitions, I think, are called exhibitions because that's what we have to do at the museum. But actually they will be, I hope, different than the usual format that we have. And so usually for a special exhibition, it would be about 3 or 4, sometimes 6 months long. I can imagine these being really short encounters, no more than 4 to 6 weeks, which is going to be difficult to sell at our museum because that's a lot of quick turnover for our staff. They might happen with some distance in between them, the 3 of them, but they'll happen in a smallish space where we will be able to show some of the amazing objects, certainly, but at least 50% of the space will be given over to programming and being able to invite people into the museum, and also, I hope, being able to send audiences outside of the museum. And so I don't know that I can get permission to give everyone a rail pass and send them where I went, but I'm hoping we have really phenomenal craft schools within a stone's throw of the museum that we don't necessarily have the longest history with, and it would be nice to have a closer connection. We've been able to develop that over this project. So I can imagine a sort of 4 to 6 week moment that's more like a festival or a meeting or a gathering, where yes, objects would be there because it's part of the language that we have to use in the museum, but people would be there and would be able to share stories and transfer or share that knowledge in the ways that I find so compelling on the trip.
That's great. Yeah, I can't imagine that it can only be a room of objects because it must by nature be complemented by this other programming and kind of breaking the walls of the museum. So yeah, that's really interesting to hear. I guess my second question is, I mean, the nature of your work is so inclusive, and I'm sure you got so many different maybe perceptions and different definitions of what craft is, and I'm just curious to hear about these stories.
Yeah. Well, I mean, It's interesting. I think there's a generation of craft historians, theorists, and also folks who are artists connected to or working within a field that they would define as craft, who have lived through several decades of having to define craft. That has been a project of craft history, I think, from the 80s through the early 2000s. And the part of my learning journey was reading through that literature and sort of figuring out how those conversations had gone. What I loved about this trip was that although I might have, and I had sort of a list of 10 questions that I went to each studio visit with, I had a big caveat at the top, so I'm really sorry if I smell when I get to your studio, I've just come off the train. So when they read that disclaimer, I had sent them questions in advance, and one of them was like, do you find affinity with the term craft? And so I wasn't necessarily asking them for a definition, but asking like, is that in the vocabulary? Sometimes people were really interested to talk about that, and when they were, their affinity or the way they defined it often came through family members. Often came through somebody passing on knowledge, or maybe it was about material specificity, like having a knowledge or a ken of a skill to do with materials. But very often people would say, next question. Like it wasn't necessarily at the heart of what they wanted to talk about, or at the heart of their sort of everyday will to get up and do the things that they did in terms of thinking. And so there was very little conversation that looked back at craft history of the last 30 or 40 years and said, well, I really loved this argument that Garth Clark made in 1984 about why we should be thinking about craft history in this way, or what craft is. And I will include some of that in the introduction to the book so I can gesture to that history, but I'm also more interested in hearing these more expansive connections to or affinities with craft as an ethos or a lived experience, rather than necessarily something that's a sort of a disciplinary term that can be defined.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Just carrying off of that point, I'm also interested in the kind of duration of some of these craft schools, and like, how is it like a year-long apprenticeship, or is it are there other models that are much shorter or much longer? Wondering about how how the different models kind of played out through the different visits.
Absolutely. It really ranged. And actually part of the duration question that was really interesting to me is it's really hard. I'm sitting, I know we had this conversation, that it's really hard to run a school. It's hard, which is why I came away profoundly moved by the conversation that I had at TSoA with you and with your students, because it was really open and thoughtful. I've never sat in an architecture setting, and I've been a visiting critic often enough where it just so happened that day it was all women, and that was really wonderful. Not that present company very much welcome if you don't identify as a woman, that's great. But that was really lovely, and so I have been particularly interested in that question of duration as it relates to how long the process will actually be around, because some of these programs are quite short-lived because it's difficult to keep things sustained. But in terms of the actual course of study, sometimes it was, I go around to somebody else's front room on a Tuesday evening and that's how I learn, or I learned from my grandmother and now I practice it myself. And so it didn't feel sort of institutionalized in that context. Sometimes it was going to some of these more seasonal craft schools like Haystack in Maine, or Pelland in North Carolina, or Pilchuck, founded by Dale Chihuly in the 70s in just outside of Seattle. And that might be a 2-week course, or it might be a summer-long experience. And then there are craft programs that I looked at that are 4-year courses of study, or 2-year master's programs. The program in artisanry at BU between 75 and 85 had a certificate of mastery, when they were really trying to attract people to come and sort of go from the apprentice to the journeyman to the master kind of model, and that just was open-ended. You stayed in the program until they called you, fit for graduation, fit for that certificate of mastery. So there was you could be there for a year, you could be there for 5 years, and it really depended. So each place had its own sort of rubric for time and duration.
Mm-hmm. And what were, this is kind of a more practical question, but like what were some of the spaces that supported like longer term, like in terms of residences, you know, kitchens, common spaces?
Yeah.
Just curious about the, you know, the different setups.
So in terms of supported people who were there for maybe like a year or a double semester, it's a really good question. So I guess in some cases where it was a university setting, there was sort of like there was often the structure of dorm rooms around that were connected to a larger program of students coming in across disciplines. There were more often than not, it is shorter term, I think, if it's outside of that model. So your program here, Stephanie, was one of the only places, I mean, we talked about conviviality in the interview that we had because you create a space that is filled with students who are here for semesters at a time and living with one another. I'm not sure if I found another model like that as I was looking, as I was traveling. Certainly I found places where there was conviviality, with people living together, but not for the time and not in the way that you all do here. Unless it was in a university setting where dorm provision, however large or small the university is, they sort of had that not just for the school that I was visiting, but for larger bodies of students.
Right. Yeah, I guess you kind of uncovered the hidden intention behind my question. It's as you know, as we've been going through all of this transition and kind of imagining these other models and other scenarios of the future school, you know, we're looking at case studies, looking at groundwork, and you know, there's some really great new examples that I'm really interested in looking at.
I loved visiting it. It was really interesting to me to think about how austere and sometimes imposing that space is, and how it is right next to a school for children that is incredibly expensive to attend. And so the sort of privilege that is connected to that particular space, and that was very much apparent in other spaces too, where a craft degree can cost $40,000 to $50,000 a year. And so, yeah, but your model here, I think, in terms of living and working was quite unique. Maybe the only other places that did something like that were where there were artists in residence, so they are not sort of student body, but it's like in Arrowmont or Penland, for example, where there's an artist in residence program, which I think is sort of akin to the work that you're doing here in a sense, but it's also not a sort of a faculty and a student body. It's a vein of artists coming through that space.
Right. It's funny you say that because I do like to compare our institution to a residency, because that's actually much more accurate.
Yeah.
I'd like to hand it over to the students sooner rather than later so that we can kind of facilitate a bigger conversation. Does anyone have questions or comments? I see Mariah already gesturing. I'll walk over.
Thanks. It was a pleasure meeting you again. We got to meet at Arkansas last year, so it's great to see the culmination of this and the larger context of your work. And actually, the visuals are really, for me, really helped to contextualize the breadth of this conversation. We talked a lot about history of craft, the PA movement, and all those things. So I think it's a really fascinating and relevant topic to us in our studio project, which is reimagining our future campus. And so we're having a lot of conversation around what programmatic spaces we need to kind of really foster our school, design build school. Anyway, my first question is, I think the question that you prompt when you mentioned these spaces is, who is your teacher, who taught you, which I think is an incredibly juicy storytelling prompt. I'm curious if you, on the flip side of that, had conversations or just what kind of key observations you noted around how people taught. So on the flip side, how they were teaching, did you notice it was more kind of observation-based, like there would be that kind of master and the student would just kind of observe, with, you know, what kind of different models for education and kind of distilling that craft did you observe? I'm sure there was a range of that.
Yeah.
It's a great question. In some visits that I made, I was able to observe teaching. In other visits, I was really coming in and having a conversation, much like we did in TSoA. And so you're right, it was a total range. When I was in the high school, it was a little bit, as you might imagine of a high school